My brother spent 4 years telling our parents I was unstable so he could inherit the house. He said it to the estate attorney 3 days before the funeral. The updated will was already in her hands. My brother Greg told our father's estate attorney, 3 days before the funeral, that I had a history of financial instability and shouldn't be trusted with the house. He said it calmly, like a man who had been rehearsing. The attorney, whose name I will not say here because it doesn't matter, wrote it down. I know this because the attorney told me himself, that same afternoon, when he called to confirm the reading time. I didn't yell when I got off the phone. Look, if you're still here, you're invested. A like and subscribe costs you nothing and it helps us find more unhinged stories like this one. We both win. Okay, back to the story. I drove to Steve's office and sat down in the chair across from his desk and said, "Tell me exactly what we have." Steve is 41 years old, a real estate attorney I've known since college, the kind of man who saves every email he's ever received and stores them in folders by year. He pulled up a file he had been building for 8 months. He turned the monitor toward me. "We have enough," he said. I nodded. My jaw ached from the drive over. I should explain who Greg is to you, because the story doesn't work without that explanation. Greg is my older brother. He is 46 years old. He works as a board member for a local charity called the Coastal Promise Foundation, which raises money for children's literacy programs in the San Diego area. He has held that position for 11 years. He is handsome in a way that makes people trust him immediately, salt and pepper hair, good posture, the kind of man who makes sustained eye contact and remembers your kids' names. My father loved him completely. I don't say that bitterly. It was simply true, the way weather is true. Greg was the older son, the steady one, the one who came back to Indianapolis after college while I moved to San Diego for work. Geography matters in families. Greg was there for Sunday dinners. I was the one on the phone. Our father, Andrew, was 68 when he died. He had lived in the same house on the north side of Indianapolis for 31 years. He bought it the year I was born, a 4-bedroom craftsman with a covered porch and a backyard that backed up to a small creek. He paid it off in 2011. By the time he passed, comparable properties in the neighborhood were listing at $340,000. Greg knew this number. He talked about it often, in that casual way people discuss things they believe are already theirs. The first time I noticed the pattern, I didn't name it. It was 4 years ago, November, Thanksgiving. I had flown in from San Diego, and during the meal Greg made a comment about a business decision I'd made the previous year, a rental property I'd sold at a modest loss after a difficult tenant situation. He mentioned it in front of our father and our father's neighbor Lisa, who had joined us for the holiday. He mentioned it warmly, with concern in his voice. "Julie just has a hard time with financial decisions sometimes. Dad, you remember that property she sold?" He patted my arm. "We worry about her." I said nothing. I ate my food. Lisa nodded sympathetically. My father looked at me with something I didn't recognize then. I recognize it now. It was the beginning of doubt. I flew back to San Diego and filed the memory away. The pattern continued. Phone calls with my father where Greg had apparently just been over and mentioned something troubling about me. An email my father forwarded once, asking if I was doing okay, had I been under stress. A Christmas visit where Greg brought up, unprompted, that I had switched jobs twice in 3 years, which was true and entirely voluntary, 2 promotions, but framed as instability. Greg never raised his voice. He never accused. He expressed concern. He loved me, he would say, which is why he worried. 22 months ago, my father was diagnosed with early-stage congestive heart failure. Not a death sentence immediately, the cardiologist was clear about that. But a signal. The kind of diagnosis that makes a family start thinking about the future out loud whether they want to or not. Greg flew into action. He became indispensable. Drove Dad to appointments. Handled the yard maintenance. Cooked on Thursdays. I called every day and visited every 6 weeks, but I was in San Diego and Greg was in Indianapolis and that gap was real. I am not going to pretend otherwise. I also sent money. I transferred $1,200 a month into my father's account for 2 years, unrequested, because his Social Security and pension together left him thin after medical bills. I told Greg about this once. He said, "That's great, Jules, really thoughtful." He never told our father where the money came from. I found out later my father thought Greg had been quietly supplementing his account. I found out because of the charity board. Here is where the story turns, and where I need you to pay attention. Greg's charity board work was genuinely prestigious locally. The Coastal Promise Foundation had a gala every year at a hotel in downtown Indianapolis, black tie, 200 guests, local politicians, the kind of event that shows up in the lifestyle section. 2 years ago, the gala was held on a Saturday in March. Greg gave a speech. He was photographed shaking hands with the mayor. He emailed a photo to the whole family. "Look at what we built this year," he wrote. "I'm proud of this community." What Greg did not know was that his foundation used a corporate email server with automatic archiving. Every email sent from a foundation address was logged and stored. This was not a secret policy. It was in the board member onboarding documents he had signed in 2013. He had simply forgotten, or never read them. Steve found this out through a contact he had at the foundation's law firm. The contact mentioned it offhandedly during a conversation about something else entirely. Steve, who saves every email he's ever received and stores them in folders by year, made a note. 6 months ago, Steve filed a formal records request with the foundation on my behalf, citing a specific board governance matter. What came back was a searchable archive of 11 years of Greg's foundation emails. Steve read through them over 2 weekends. He called me on a Sunday evening and said, "You need to hear some of this." Greg had been using his foundation board email, the address that ended in the charity's domain, to conduct personal correspondence he believed was private. There were emails to the foundation's HOA vendor, a property management company the foundation contracted with for their community education spaces, in which Greg had requested that specific bylaw enforcement actions be directed at a rental property on the north side of Indianapolis. The property was identified by street address. The address was 2 blocks from my father's house. I pulled up county records that night. The rental property belonged to a man named Andrew, who was my father's name. My father owned one piece of rental property, a small duplex he had bought in 2003 as a retirement investment. He had mentioned it rarely. I had not thought about it in years. Greg had been weaponizing HOA bylaw enforcement against our father's duplex. Over 14 months, the duplex had received 11 separate violation notices from the HOA management company, covering everything from exterior paint standards to gutter maintenance to landscaping requirements. Each violation carried a fine. The fines ranged from $150 to $400. My father had been paying them out of the account I had been supplementing. He had told Greg about the notices, and Greg had expressed appropriate outrage on his behalf, suggested the HOA was probably just aggressive with everyone, helped him write a few response letters that resolved nothing. My father trusted him completely. But the emails went further. There was a chain, for emails across 3 months, between Greg and a man whose first name was Kevin, who appeared to be a real estate investor. In the chain, Greg discussed the likely timeline for my father's health decline. He referenced the duplex as a near-term liquidity opportunity. He used the phrase "the main property," which in context referred to the craftsman on the north side. He wrote, "Once the fines accumulate to the point where the duplex becomes a burden, he'll want to simplify. We can position that as the first step. And then, Julie has been pushing to manage his assets for years but Dad won't allow it. I've made sure he understands that's not a safe option. Julie has been pushing to manage his assets for years. I have never once asked my father for anything related to his finances. Not once. Not a loan, not a co-signing, not a conversation about what would happen to the house. The one time he brought it up himself, I told him he had plenty of time to think about it and change the subject because he seemed uncomfortable. Greg had built an entire phantom version of me and fed it to our father for 4 years. And apparently to Kevin, who appeared to be waiting for the right moment to make an offer. I held the folder Steve printed for me and did not cry. My hands were steadier than they had any right to be. Here is what we did next. Steve reached out to our father's estate attorney, a woman named Lisa who had drawn up his original will 8 years prior. He requested a confidential consultation on behalf of a family member. Lisa agreed to meet. Steve and I drove to Indianapolis on a Thursday, said nothing to Greg, and sat down with Lisa for 90 minutes. We showed her the email archive. We showed her the HOA violation history and the corresponding fine payments from my father's account. We showed her the Kevin correspondence. We showed her 2 years of my monthly transfers, which I had records of, and the fact that my father had attributed them to Greg. Lisa was quiet for a long time after she finished reading. Then she said, "I'll need to speak with your father." My father was in the hospital at that point, a controlled admission for fluid management, not a crisis but a reminder. Lisa went to see him on a Friday afternoon. I don't know exactly what she said to him. I know that she was there for 2 hours. I know that when I called my father that evening, his voice sounded different. Not broken. Clarified, maybe. He said, "Jules, I owe you an apology." I told him he didn't owe me anything. He said, "Yes I do. I've been unfair to you." I didn't know. He updated his will the following Monday. Lisa handled it. I was not present. I did not ask what the new terms were. I figured I would find out when the time came. My father died 7 weeks later. It was not sudden but it was faster than the cardiologist had predicted. A secondary infection complicated the cardiac situation and he declined over 10 days in a way that felt both gradual and like falling. I was there at the end. Greg was there too. We sat on opposite sides of the bed for the last 3 days and said almost nothing to each other. Whatever Greg knew or suspected, he gave no sign of it. He cried at the bedside. I believe those tears were real. People contain more than one true thing at a time. The funeral was held on a Tuesday at a chapel on the north side. There were maybe 60 people. My father was well liked in the neighborhood. His bowling league came. His cardiologist came, which surprised me. Lisa, the neighbor, sat in the third row and cried quietly the entire service. Greg spoke. He was good at it, of course. He talked about our father's work ethic, his garden, the way he fixed things himself rather than calling anyone. He talked about the house, specifically, about what it meant to come home to that porch. He talked about legacy. He did not look at me during any of it. Afterward, at the reception in the church hall, Greg found a moment when we were briefly alone near the coffee table and said, low and even, I want you to know I'll handle the estate fairly. I think we both know Dad would want me to manage the transition. Whatever your concerns are, you can bring them to me directly. You don't have to involve attorneys. He picked up a coffee cup. I know this family has been stressful for you. I've always tried to be a stabilizing presence. The way he said stabilizing made my stomach turn. I looked at him. I said, okay. He nodded, satisfied. The estate reading was scheduled for that Thursday, 2 days after the funeral, at Lisa the estate attorney's office. Greg arrived first. I know this because Steve, who had driven from San Diego with me, texted me from the parking lot, he's already inside. I sat in the car for a moment. My stomach was not right. It had not been right for 3 months. I breathed for a count of 5 and got out of the car. The conference room was small. Lisa the estate attorney sat at the head of the table. Greg was to her right, jacket on, a yellow legal pad in front of him. Beside him sat a woman I didn't recognize, late 30s, blonde hair, who Greg introduced as his assistant. Steve sat beside me to my left. And in the corner chair, quietly, sat a man I had asked to be present, the foundation's executive director, whose first name was Andrew, the same as my father's, which I have thought about more than once since. He was there because Steve had sent him a letter 3 days prior explaining that certain archived board emails contained material relevant to the estate of a foundation-adjacent community member. He was there out of institutional caution. He did not yet know specifically what he was about to hear. Lisa began. She thanked everyone for coming. She said that Andrew had been a thorough and deliberate man when it came to his final wishes and that she had known him for 8 years and respected him greatly. She said that the will had been updated 49 days prior to his death, and that the update had been executed with full legal competency and his complete informed consent, witnessed by 2 staff members and documented with a brief video statement from Andrew himself. Greg shifted in his chair. He uncapped his pen. Lisa, read the original will first, for context. Under the original terms, the Craftsman house and all personal property went to Greg. The duplex and the investment accounts, approximately $62,000, were to be divided equally. The note in the margin of the original, which Lisa read aloud, stated that Greg was designated primary because of his local presence and role in Andrew's care. Then she set down the original and picked up the updated document. Greg wrote something on his legal pad. Lisa said, in the updated will, Andrew has designated Julie as sole beneficiary of the Craftsman property and all personal contents. The duplex is to be sold and the proceeds split equally. The investment accounts go entirely to Julie, with the notation that this reflects a correction of a financial imbalance that existed during his lifetime that Andrew wished to formally acknowledge. Greg stopped writing. Lisa continued. She said that Andrew had also included an addendum, a personal letter, which he had asked her to read aloud in full at the estate reading. She put on her reading glasses. The letter was 2 pages. I will not reproduce all of it here. But I will tell you what my father wrote about Greg, because he wrote it clearly and he asked for it to be read in a room. He wrote that he had been shown evidence over the past 7 weeks that Greg had used his position in the family to misrepresent Julie's character to him over a period of years. He wrote that he had been led to believe that Julie was financially unreliable, when in fact she had been supporting his household silently for 2 years while he attributed that support elsewhere. He wrote that he was ashamed it had taken him so long to see what was being done, and that he was more ashamed that he had been, in his words, a willing audience because it was easier than asking questions. He wrote that the house on the north side was Julie's because Julie had paid for it twice, once in the monthly transfers and once in the years she had been made to feel like a problem in her own family. He wrote that he loved both his children. He also wrote that he expected Greg to read this and understand that he had known. Lisa took off her reading glasses and placed the letter on the table. Greg did not move for a long time. His assistant looked at her hands. The executive director in the corner had gone very still. I looked at my brother. His face had done something I had never seen it do before. The composure was intact at the surface, but underneath it something had gone soft and wrong, the way a wall looks right before water damage shows through. He was looking at the letter on the table. Then he looked up at me. I thought about the Sunday dinners I'd missed. The Thanksgivings I'd flown in for and felt wrong the entire time without knowing why. The call from my father asking if I was doing okay, had I been under stress. The word stabilizing. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. Steve opened the folder he had carried in from the car and slid a copy across the table to Greg. It was the email archive, tabbed and highlighted, 43 pages. Beside it he placed the HOA violation correspondence and the Kevin exchange. The page with the sentence Julie has been pushing to manage his assets for years was clipped to the front. Greg looked at the folder. He looked at the executive director. The executive director said, quietly, "We'll need to speak after this meeting, Greg." Greg said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I don't know what you think this is, but it is not what it looks like." Steve said, "In 2021 you told your father that Julie has a hard time with financial decisions sometimes. Is that what this doesn't look like?" Greg said, "That was a private family conversation." Steve said, "This email wasn't," and he tapped the folder. Greg's assistant stood up. She said she had another appointment and left the room without looking at Greg. The door closed with a sound that was very quiet and very final. Lisa said that she had nothing further to present and that the estate would proceed on the terms she had outlined. She said this in the voice of someone who has delivered bad news before and knows there is no kind angle to it. Greg looked at me one more time. I don't know what he was looking for. I held the copy of my father's letter and did not look away from him. He left without speaking. Here is what happened in the months that followed. The executive director of the foundation opened an internal governance review of Greg's board conduct within 10 days of the estate reading. The archived emails were provided in full. The review found that Greg had used his board affiliation and vendor relationships to direct HOA enforcement activity for personal benefit, in violation of the foundation's conflict of interest policy, which he had signed annually. He was removed from the board in a closed vote 6 weeks later. The foundation issued a brief statement about a board transition. The local charity community is small. People understood what the statement meant. Kevin, the investor Greg had been corresponding with, withdrew his interest in the property without explanation. I never contacted him. I didn't need to. The duplex was sold in March. My share of the proceeds, combined with the investment accounts, covered the estate taxes and legal fees with enough left over to fund a small repair project on the Craftsman's Foundation, which had needed attention for 3 years that my father had been quietly deferring. I moved into the house in April. I painted the porch in May. It took me 2 weekends and I did not call anyone for help because I wanted to do it alone, the same way I had been alone in this family for a long time and had eventually learned to call that independence instead of abandonment. Greg's wife, a woman named Rachel who I had always liked, called me in June. She said she was not calling on his behalf. She said she was calling because she had read the letter, the one Lisa had read aloud, and she wanted me to know that she had not known about any of it. I believed her. I told her I believed her. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "He told me you had always been difficult." I'm sorry, I accepted that. I told her it wasn't her fault. We did not talk long. She filed for divorce in August. I spoke to Greg once, briefly, at a distance, in the parking lot of the funeral home when I returned to pick up my father's death certificates. He had been there for the same reason. He said my name. I stopped. He said, "I want you to know that I loved Dad." I said, "I know you did." He said, "This isn't how I wanted things to go." I said, "I know that too." Then I got in my car and drove back to the house on the north side, the one with the covered porch and the backyard that backs up to a small creek. Steve came over that Saturday and we sat on the porch with coffee and watched the yard go dark. He asked me how I was doing. I said I was okay, and I meant something close to that, not all the way but close. He said, "Your dad knew at the end." I said, "Yeah. He did." My father had written in the letter that he was more ashamed that he had been a willing audience because it was easier than asking questions. I have read that sentence many times. I don't read it with anger anymore. I read it as the truest thing he ever said about himself, and about families, and about how a person who loves you can still be the instrument of something done to you, because looking is harder than not looking and most people choose what is easier for as long as they can. Greg chose convenience. He called it concern. He called it family. He called it being a stabilizing presence in a family that, according to him, functioned just fine. He was wrong about that. But he was right that the family was mine. I am the one living in it now.